They say I'm cold now. They say I've changed. They say I'm distant. Like that's a flaw. But the truth is I didn't become cold. I became quiet. Because for the first time in my life, I needed to hear my own soul speak. I remember the night everything shifted. It wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors, no shouting, no final text. Just silence. My wife had left a few weeks before. The house was half empty. Even the echo of her voice was starting to fade. I sat on the couch with a warm cup of black coffee, the kind I used to drink in the garage to avoid another argument. This time, I drank it slowly, in peace. Across the street, a couple was yelling over groceries. She was louder than the traffic. He looked like I used to, tired, silent, shrinking. And I thought to myself, they'll call you cold when you stop tolerating fire. That's when it hit me. I didn't lose her. I lost myself trying to keep her. And now I'm not angry. I'm not bitter. I'm just awake. So if you've ever chosen quiet over chaos, if you've ever realized that solitude isn't punishment, it's protection, then maybe this story is for you. Because the longer a man stays silent, the louder his truth becomes. I wasn't always like this. There was a time I would have done anything to keep love alive. I remember the early years of my marriage. We had a house in the suburbs, a small lawn, a 2-car garage. We had 2 kids, a dog named Max, and a calendar filled with birthdays, meetings, school plays. And I wore that life like armor, like it made me real. But if I'm honest, I was never truly present in it, because I was always trying so hard to keep it from falling apart. I woke up every morning thinking, what does she need today? What did I forget yesterday? What do I have to fix to keep the peace? And peace was always the goal, even if it meant losing little pieces of myself in the process. I stopped going to the gym, stopped playing guitar, stopped calling my friends, stopped asking for anything that wasn't directly related to making her happy. Because somewhere along the way, I believed that love meant sacrifice. And if I sacrificed enough, maybe she'd see me. Maybe she'd stay. At first it felt noble. Like I was doing the right thing. Like I was being the kind of man a woman could depend on. But slowly, quietly, it began to feel like I was disappearing. I was the one who apologized first, even when I didn't know what I'd done wrong. I was the one who picked up the slack, changed my schedule, bit my tongue. I became an expert at walking on eggshells, a master of fixing moods I didn't create, a silent partner in a home that was getting louder on the inside. And the crazy part? No one noticed. Not even her. To everyone else, we looked fine, smiling at family gatherings, posting vacation photos, laughing at the dinner table, but behind closed doors, I was tired. And not just from work or lack of sleep. I was tired from carrying it all, the tension, the unspoken rules, the emotional labor. I remember one night, we had friends over for dinner. She was charming, engaging, the perfect host. I did the dishes after everyone left, turned off the lights, locked the doors, and when I sat down next to her, she barely looked up from her phone. That night, I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I realized I wasn't her partner anymore. I was her support system, her default setting, her background noise. I don't say this to blame her. She had her own battles, her own loneliness, but the silence between us wasn't just space. It was a canyon, and every day I gave more of myself to bridge that gap, only to watch the other side drift further away. I used to think love was about proving you could stay, proving you were dependable, proving you could hold everything together when it was falling apart. But the truth? Sometimes love becomes a performance, and when you're the only one still clapping, it starts to feel like a lie. One morning, I woke up before the Sunday. The house was still, the air heavy. I walked into the kitchen, made coffee like I always did, and just stood there, holding the mug in both hands. That's when it hit me. I hadn't thought about what I wanted in years. Not what would keep her happy, not what the kids needed, not what made sense on paper, but me, the man I used to be, the man who loved road trips without maps, who stayed up writing songs no one would hear, who dreamed of seeing the Grand Canyon alone, just to feel how small he really was. That man? He was gone, replaced by a version of himself that existed only in reaction to someone else's moods. That morning, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't pack a bag. I just stood there and grieved, not for the marriage, not for the woman in the other room, but for the man I had stopped being to keep something alive. That was already gone, and from that moment, something inside me began to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way a tide changes, pulling you somewhere new, even if you're not ready yet to swim. The shift wasn't sudden. It didn't come with a slammed door, no final argument, no suitcase by the front steps. It came with silence, the kind of silence that doesn't scream. It just settles. In the spaces between, "How was your day?" and "I'm fine." It showed up in small things, like the way she no longer asked if I was tired, or how I stopped asking if she needed help, because the answers didn't matter anymore. We became polite strangers, sharing a mortgage, sharing a Wi-Fi connection, but not a life. I'd come home from work and sit in my truck for 10 minutes, not because I was on the phone, but because I wasn't ready to walk into the quiet. Sometimes the kids were there, sometimes not, but even when the house was full, I still felt alone. I began to notice how heavy I felt, not in my body, but in my spirit. I was still doing the things a man is supposed to do, working, providing, showing up, but something inside me had cracked, and I wasn't sure if anyone else could hear it. One night, she asked if I had remembered to pay the cable bill. That was it. "No, how are you?" "No, you've seemed distant lately." Just that. A transaction. A reminder. I nodded, then walked out onto the back porch, sat in the cold, let the silence wrap around me like a blanket, and whispered to myself, this can't be all there is. Because if marriage is just about surviving, then maybe I wasn't made for it. If love is just another list of responsibilities, then maybe I'd misunderstood the entire thing. I didn't want to be dramatic, didn't want to be ungrateful. We had a house, food, a retirement account, but I was starving. Starving for connection, for presence, for someone to look at me and not just see obligation. And the hardest part? I had no one to tell. Not because there weren't people around, but because I didn't know how to say it out loud, without sounding weak or selfish. Because that's what men are taught, right? You don't complain. You carry. You don't ask for more. You make do. You don't walk away. You fix it. But what if you've already tried fixing it, and the pieces just keep cutting deeper every time you hold them? What then? The breaking point didn't come with anger. It came with numbness. I stopped talking as much, stopped trying to win her back, stopped showing up with small surprises, because nothing changed. No matter what I did, she remained distant. I remained invisible. I used to think, if I could just explain things the right way, she would understand me, that if I found the right tone, the right time, the perfect sentence, maybe she'd finally hear me. But over time, I realized something brutal. When someone no longer wants to understand you, it doesn't matter how clearly you speak. They'll still choose not to listen. That's when I fell into a quiet kind of grief, the kind that doesn't show on your face, but lingers in your shoulders, and your breath, and in the way your smile stops reaching your eyes. I'd be laughing with friends, but inside, I was folding in on myself, still paying bills, still mowing the lawn, still saying I love you before bed. But it felt mechanical, like going through the motions of a life that no longer felt like mine. And then one morning, I looked in the mirror, really looked, not to fix my tie, not to shave, just to see the man I'd become. He looked tired, but not from lack of sleep. He looked small, but not from age. He looked like someone who had spent so many years bending that he forgot what it felt like to stand straight. And that day, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't leave out of anger. I wouldn't yell, wouldn't blame, wouldn't burn it all down, but I also wouldn't keep disappearing. Because there comes a time in a man's life when choosing yourself is not an act of rebellion, it's an act of survival. And for me, that time had come. I didn't pack a bag the next day. I didn't leave in the middle of the night. I wasn't running away. I just stopped waiting for the moment she'd come sit next to me on the porch, stopped waiting for that random touch on the shoulder that said, I see you. Stopped waiting to be chosen by someone who no longer knew how to love me. I stayed a few more months, long enough to finish what needed finishing. The paperwork, the final conversations, the goodbye that never really came. And when the day arrived, I didn't cry. I didn't feel free, either. I just felt still, like the storm had passed, and now I was walking through the wreckage quietly, looking for anything worth salvaging. I moved into a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, just enough space for a bed, a chair, a coffee pot, and the version of myself I hadn't seen in years. The silence followed me, but this time it didn't hurt. It didn't accuse. It didn't echo. It invited. I started doing small things again. Morning coffee with the blinds open. Jazz on the speakers instead of morning news. Reading books cover to cover, because I wasn't distracted by someone else's disappointment. I picked up my guitar again. Not to impress anyone, not to prove I was still fun, but just to remember what my fingers used to sound like when they weren't typing reports or signing checks. Some nights I lit a candle just for myself, cooked a meal for one, and sat at the table not in sadness, but in reverence, because I was no longer rushing through my own life to keep someone else from being uncomfortable, and slowly, the silence became sacred. I stopped checking my phone for texts that never came, stopped overthinking the gaps in conversation, stopped apologizing for needing time alone. Instead, I began listening to the way the wind hits the window at 2 a.m., to my own breathing as I fall asleep, to the way peace doesn't announce itself, but simply settles in, like an old friend who never needed to knock. People started noticing. They said I seemed distant, different. Some said I was bitter, cold, guarded. But I wasn't any of those things. I was clear. I wasn't cold. I just no longer wanted to be warmed by fires. That had already burned me. I wasn't bitter. I just knew what sweet tasted like, and that wasn't it. And I wasn't guarded. I was simply careful, with what little remained of the man who had once given too much, too freely, to people who didn't know how to hold it. I still believe in love. I just no longer believe it should cost me my voice, my clarity, or my peace. These days, I wake up early, not because I have to, but because I want to witness the sun rise. On a life I no longer resent. I journal while the coffee brews. I stretch. I pray, not for someone to come save me, but in gratitude that I finally learned how to stop abandoning myself. I walk slower now, talk less, smile more, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes when no one's watching, and you realize you're actually okay. And when people ask, "Don't you get lonely?" I tell them the truth. Lonely? No, because for the first time in my life, I'm not surrounded by people who only loved the version of me that served them. For the first time, I'm not performing. I'm just being. And that is the most dangerous kind of peace a man can carry. The kind that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't prove. It just is. And if she comes, she comes. But she'll have to bring more than a pretty smile and a handful of expectations. She'll have to bring calm and depth and a love that knows the difference between control and care, because I won't trade this peace again. Not for lust, not for drama, not even for comfort. This silence I've found, it's not empty. It's full of everything I used to pray someone else would give me. Stillness, respect, presence, clarity. I used to think being alone was the worst thing that could happen to a man, but I was wrong. The worst thing is losing yourself for someone who doesn't even notice you're gone. Now I sit with myself each night. No regrets, no need to explain, just the sound of a life slowly being rebuilt by a man who finally knows that peace is never lonely. So no, I'm not angry. I'm not broken. I'm not hiding behind solitude. I'm living inside of it. Because sometimes the greatest love story is the one you finally write with yourself. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need validation. It just needs quiet mornings, a clear mind, and a soul that no longer feels the need to beg for space. I know now, peace isn't loud. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't demand attention. It just sits beside you, like a loyal dog, on a porch at sunrise, and asks nothing but your presence. And if you're a man listening to this, feeling like you've given everything, held everything together, only to lose yourself in the process, hear me. You are not cold. You are not bitter. You are not broken. You are becoming clear. And sometimes, clarity sounds like silence, but it feels like home. If you find this video good, then don't forget to share it with people in the same situation as you. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. Goodbye. See you in the next video.